All right, today we're going to talk about the rest of the Venezuelan revolutions and how they move out further west, going into present-day Colombia and Ecuador, and then starts moving further south toward the western coastline and down the western coastline of South America. But before we do that, we have to talk about the revolutionary movements in Peru itself, because that gets going around the same time that the Venezuelan revolutions are coming to a head and successfully proclaiming independence finally. So we're going to see a confluence, kind of running into each other, of the Venezuelan revolutions, the kind of northern part of South America's revolt, and Peru's independence movement as they kind of collide with each other in the 1820s. And then we'll go into the longer term ramifications of that for any types of unity movements amongst all these countries in the 1820s going into 1830. And after that, we'll talk about how Brazil gains independence in the 18 teens, basically. All right, so we'll start off with Peru's independence movement. So Peru's independence is very much different from a lot of the other revolutionary attempts that we've seen in this module so far. The revolutions in Mexico, in Central America, and in Venezuela often were pushed and developed by constitutional conventions, groups of representatives of some kind or another that come together to write up a formal government document that splits powers into different government branches and whatnot. And that's the big kind of beginning in the locust of the independence movement for those what would become those nations. But a lot of South America is very different from that, especially the Peruvian Revolution. They will rely more on military leaders and victories on the battlefield to proclaim independence, and then they'll figure out what kind of government they want to build afterward. So especially for Peru, a lot of the independence movement very closely follows one guy's career, and this guy's name is Jose de San Martin. He was born into a noble colonial family in modern-day northern Argentina, which would be kind of back then the southern part of Peru, the viceroyalty of Peru. So he came from a Spanish family that had come over from Spain and had set themselves up as a colonial landowning family in the viceroyalty. And he was born in the viceroyalty to that family. So as he kind of, in his younger days, as he's a kind of late teen and into his 20s, he goes back to Spain and fights in the Spanish War for Independence against the French invasion, basically Napoleon's invasion and conquest of Spain. So San Martin is directly involved in that, not just as a soldier, but he's promoted up the ranks, and he leads whole companies of Spanish soldiers fighting to kick the French out of Spain from 1808 to about 1811. So he's directly involved in those early wars. In 1812, he requested a post. He requested to be returned to the colony, his kind of home territory. So the Spanish army, the kind of informal Spanish army of the junta, they agreed to send him back to the viceroyalty of Peru. So his original request was to go to Lima, the capital city of the viceroyalty, but on his way he eventually found a way to get on a different boat, basically, and instead went to Buenos Aires on the eastern coast of South America, and which was also a kind of hotbed of anti-royalist sentiment in all of the Spanish colonies in the southern part of South America. Once he arrives in Buenos Aires, he starts building a revolutionary army, basically. Small scale at first, but then he quietly recruits volunteers into this, while also faking an illness. Remember, officially he's a government soldier in the viceroyalty, So he kind of fakes an illness so he doesn't have to show up to work on a daily basis. And he gets a government appointment to another city called Mendoza. And in that city, Mendoza, he's going to continue building up his force of revolutionaries, basically, and training them and preparing them for a revolutionary movement to overthrow the viceroyalty in the south. And he particularly wants to be in the city of Mendoza because that's the kind of crossing over point. It's kind of a key to overland routes that would go to get into Lima without having to go through the normal route from the south through upper Peru. So Mendoza is a strategically important town, and that's where he is, and that's why he wants to be there to build this army. So he's kind of faking an illness so he doesn't have to daily kind of be at work at his government post, and while he's away from his government job, he's out secretly building up this revolutionary force. And all this planning takes several years. So in 1817, very early in the year, he launches his forces across the Andes Mountains from the Buenos Aires area on this map, and goes to the west and goes after the capital city of the southern viceroyalty at Santiago. So historians say that in a series of brilliant military moves, brilliant military strategy, he captures Santiago in February 1817 and defeated the last of the royalist forces outside of Santiago at the Battle of Maipú in April 1818, so just on this map just south of Santiago. So there's a couple major and kind of historical important images by painters that depict the Battle of Maipú. And then after the battle was over, the celebration amongst San Martin and his generals, realizing that they've won the battle and they were going to run the new government, basically. The next logical step militarily would have been to go back and attack Lima directly. And you can see Lima is way up in the kind of top left corner on this map. The problem, though, is that Lima is the capital of the viceroyalty of Peru, so it's fairly heavily defended by royalist Spanish government forces. So San Martin doesn't think he has the military strength. He doesn't have enough soldiers, basically, to march up the coastline and get to Lima and then have to do battle with this large amount of government soldiers. So he instead basically decides to wait. He decides to delay that attack until maybe something happens and a better opportunity will present itself for him to attack Lima and try to conquer the viceroyalty of Peru entirely by taking its capital city. So he instead waits for a while, and a couple of years go by, and he sees his opportunity in 1820-21 when there's a kind of liberal coup against Ferdinand VII in Spain itself that basically takes him prisoner and forces him to re-implement the Constitution of 1812. So there's a lot of political confusion going on in Spain itself, and a lot of the soldiers in Lima actually leave the city and they start preparing to actually get on boats and go to other parts of the colonies or go back to Spain itself to try to have some kind of impact on what's going on with Spanish politics in Spain itself. So as those soldiers start to vacate the city of Lima, San Martin sees his opportunity finally after a couple years of waiting, and he goes to Lima in July 1821. And basically when he arrived in July of 21, he has a small military force with him, but the city is fairly undefended. So he gets into the city without even having to attack. And once he gets into the city, he gives a speech where he officially declares it liberated from Spanish rule. And he declares Peru to be an independent country, basically, and gets himself to be appointed the so-called protector of Peru. So he is the leader of the new revolutionary Peruvian government. And this government theoretically stretches all the way down to Santiago and would include a lot of the southern Spanish, formerly Spanish colonies. So this is all kind of one unified type government. The problem, though, is that his revolutionary government is at the brink of bankruptcy just 6 months later. And that causes all kinds of major problems. So he, as protector, is the leader of this government, and so he's kind of seen as the symbolic person who's responsible for all these problems. So by the end of 1821, the government's having all kinds of major problems. A lot of the soldiers are starting to desert because a lot of times they're not being paid, so they're getting frustrated with the government. San Martin's government started to persecute Spanish landowners and Spanish businessmen, kind of accusing them of treason, which obviously hurt the Peruvian economy, because there's a lot of economic chaos, basically, because the rich landowners and the big businesses are kind of losing their leaders and sometimes getting confiscated by government. So there's all kinds of economic problems and confusion going on. And then the government started to print its own paper money, which this is a brand new government, so a lot of people don't know if it's even going to survive. So the paper money is fairly worthless, with such a large amount of inflation in the new country. So the economic problems are pretty dire. And by the end of 1821, both the royalists that have been defeated, the royalists who want to turn Peru back into a colony of Spain because they're loyal to the Spanish monarch, they start conspiring against him. And also a lot of the Republican forces who helped him overthrow the Spanish government and bring Peruvian independence in the first place. A lot of those Republican forces start plotting against San Martin and the government itself. So San Martin is in a really difficult position. And at this point, he starts sending messages to Simón Bolívar and the government of Gran Colombia, as it was then known, basically asking for help to stabilize this newly independent country. And of course, Bolivar is interested in this because Bolivar wants to, destroy Spanish ownership of anything in South America. So Bolivar will start to get involved with San Martin in trying to strike some kind of deal to guarantee that they can combine their forces and kick out the royalists and guarantee South American independence from Spain for the long term. But it's all, very confusing. That's a very kind of shorthand and quick explanation for all these negotiations that are going on. But there's other conflicts that are going on at the same time. We have to remember that the area called Quito, the kingdom of Quito, in this map in green, lies really straight between the kind of Grand Colombian government that is a combination of Colombia in purple on this map, purple and red, and the government of Venezuela. So Bolivar's revolution, the Venezuelan revolution, had tried to combine those two, and in combining both Venezuela and Colombia, Bolivar also wanted to bring Quito into this kind of grand alliance, this kind of northern South American superstate. So Bolivar is always interested in doing that. And at this point, 1821 or so, the Colombian Congress, the Congress of Gran Colombia, had elected Bolivar president under its new constitution that had been passed in 1821. So Bolivar is president of this northern government. And he starts, as president, the head of the administration, he starts appointing kind of local governors and department leaders, provincial governors basically, all over what is today Colombia and Venezuela. He appoints a vice president, and he basically tells the vice president, you basically run Venezuela and Colombia and just kind of run the government as a caretaker, and Bolivar himself is going to take the armies and start moving further south to continue fighting and attacking Spanish royalists. So with most royalists defeated in pretty much all of the Colombian areas, in 1821, he took his soldiers and started marching further south into Quito, the area in green. So all this is going on at the same moment then San Martin's government in Peru, even further south, is running into giant problems in late 1821. So Quito is still technically in a revolutionary war against its own royalists. So there's some Spanish royalists still in Quito that are fighting to keep Quito as a Spanish colony. And that's what Bolivar wants to enter Quito to attack. But San Martin, further south in Peru, is also sending messages to the Quito revolutionary leaders. So the Quito leaders are getting messages from both Bolivar and from San Martin in Peru, offering to help Quito defeat its royalists. In exchange, though, they both want Quito to join their country. So Bolivar wants to get Quito to join this giant Colombian government to the north, and San Martin wants Quito to join Peru in the south. So the two powers are really trying to force Quito into an alliance with themselves. And the negotiations are pretty hectic and they're tense. But to make a very long story pretty short, eventually Bolivar got a treaty with Quito in May 1821, which basically meant that Quito would give Bolivar some troops and Bolivar would run the war to defeat the royalists, and if he won, that Quito would become a protectorate or an area of the Grand Colombian government to the north. So Bolivar, once that deal is struck, sends his one of his most trusted generals named Antonio Jose de Sucre to Quito to command the Republican army that's going to fight off, he hopes, the royalist forces in Quito. So as Sucre started to win on the battlefield, Bolivar is increasingly pressuring Quito's leaders to enter immediately as a formal part of the government of Gran Colombia. And he keeps telling the Quito leaders, the people of Quito want this. The people they want to join with this northern superstate. But the Quito leaders try to keep their independence. They're trying to negotiate. They're basically trying to get what they want, which is help to defeat the royalists to become an independent country, but they also want to be an independent country. They don't want to be under Bolivar's thumb or under San Martin's thumb from the south. So the final major victories by Sucre occur in spring 1822. And Sucre, once the kind of Quito war is over and the royalists are defeated and it's pretty clear that Quito is going to become its own country, Sucre really pushed the Quito city leaders. And we have to remember that Quito is this whole area in green, the whole kind of kingdom, but the capital city is also called Quito. So there's a city that has its own city level government, and Sucre pushed the city level governors, leaders, to vote to join Gran Colombia. But we have to remember that that's the capital city, but they're only like the mayors of the city themselves, so they don't have authority over the rest of the whole kingdom, the whole area in green. But that's Sucre's argument is basically the leaders of the capital city have voted to join Gran Colombia, so why doesn't the whole rest of the kingdom just follow them? And Bolivar sees an opportunity here, so he enters the city of Quito in June 1822 and declares the whole kingdom to now be a department or an area of Gran Colombia. And he appoints Sucre to be the first kind of governor of this area. So a lot of city residents in Quito start making a lot of statements saying, yeah, maybe our leaders on the city level voted to do this, but that doesn't mean the whole kingdom did it. And now Bolivar is, walking through our streets and giving speeches and saying the whole kingdom is now part of Gran Colombia. And a lot of people, see this as a trick. And in Quito itself, even as Bolivar is walking around, a lot of people start writing big signs and hanging them out their windows and putting them in public places and whatnot. And the signs often say the same thing. And that is, quote, this is the last day of despotism and the first day of the same thing, end quote. And despotism is really a kind of 17 and 1800s word for what we would today call dictatorship. So those kind of signs being hung and flown all over the city of Quito basically means that Bolivar and the Colombians are promising the end of dictatorship, but they're just really starting a whole new dictatorship that most of us don't even want, to empower themselves, to expand the territory under the government that they lead. So a lot of the people in Quito are very resistant to all of this, and they realize it's a giant trick and that really none of this is very legitimate. So they still feel that they're basically occupied by a foreign force, and they don't like it. But they don't have big enough army to resist the Colombian army under Bolivar and Sucre's leadership. And one of the big cities named Guayaquil is further to the south, and that becomes one of the kind of hotbeds of this anger toward the Colombians. The anger in the kingdom, in the whole area in Green Quito, will continue over the years until they'll make their own revolutionary independence movement against the government of Gran Colombia. So Bolivar himself, even as he is kind of proclaiming the whole area annexed to Gran Colombia, he has to deal with these kind of popular statements amongst the people and have resistance amongst the people. He does a lot of very questionable things and possibly even very illegal things to force the whole area of Quito, the whole kingdom, to be basically under his control. So he formally basically annexes the area. And Bolivar says the people are free and the people want to do this, but anyone that's looking around the city realizes that that's not very true. And he starts taking some very heavy-handed steps to control Quito and make sure it stays under the authority of the overall government of Gran Colombia. So I'll talk about those for a second. Number one, he'll start shutting down any city government leadership that complains about this stuff. So that largely includes Guayaquil, the large town to the south. So if certain city governments start complaining or start issuing formal decrees from their city level or formal statements saying that they don't agree with this annexation, then he'll just shut down their city government and sometimes force those city level leaders into exile. So that's very heavy-handed all by itself. Number two, he'll implement martial law in different areas. So he'll enforce curfews, and he'll basically suspend legal government, and he'll govern those cities, those areas under martial law, which basically means he's going to send in the troops, and anyone who complains will be arrested, and they'll be held without charges until Bolivar just decides himself to release them. So that's kind of patently illegal, and it's something that dictators very often do throughout world history. And so Bolivar is kind of showing how much he's willing to use force to keep control over the whole area of Quito, the whole kingdom. He also restarts the native tribute system, where natives were forced to basically pay yearly or monthly taxes to the local government. So that's a big controversial thing, because that's a hated institution in Quito and even in the rest of Gran Colombia. I mean, the Colombian government itself ended that native tribute. The Colombian government passed laws that made stuff illegal. So even where Bolivar is coming from, his home areas don't even have that native tribute, because it was seen as so unfair and repressive of the native populations. And Bolivar will also himself decide to start selling monopoly rights to certain companies in different areas, specifically over the salt and tobacco markets. So that's, again, the types of things that dictators do without consulting their legislatures or anything like that. He just goes and does it to start raising money for the new government, to pay for its needs, to pay for its soldiers and its other costs that the new government's incurring. Bolivar's next step is to personally meet with San Martin, because remember, San Martin has been asking for help to stabilize the Peruvian government, because San Martin is in a really difficult position. He has his own soldiers kind of melting away in protest, and there's also the reemergence of a Peruvian royalist movement to try to overthrow the revolutionary government that San Martin runs and turn Peru back into a viceroyalty, turn it back into a colony of Spain. So San Martin is in a very difficult position, and he's been asking Bolivar for help for quite a while by now, and they finally do meet. And San Martin at this meeting continues asking for help, and Bolivar refuses to help. He refuses to send forces into Peru, refuses to send money, and this is a really interesting kind of stance from Bolivar, because Bolivar is always looking for an opportunity to invade a new place and to fight against any Spanish royalists wherever they are. So Bolivar's refusal to send in troops and to actively help San Martin in Peru overcome Spanish royalists is very interesting and very shocking, not just to historians today, but shocking to San Martin and shocking to a lot of Peruvian revolutionaries. They fully expected Bolivar to come in and help, and they're just surprised that Bolivar refuses. So San Martin, and a lot of historians ever since, believe that Bolivar refused to send help because Bolivar was worried that San Martin was such a powerful personality and leader in Peru that if Bolivar went into Peru with an army and defeated the royalists, that most of the Peruvian revolutionaries will decide to keep San Martin in power. So Bolivar seems to have figured, this is the accusation at least, that Bolivar himself and the Colombians, they should sit this out and allow the Spanish royalists to destroy San Martin and his government. And once that happens, that Bolivar and the Colombians would be able to ride into Peru as the saviors, defeat the Spanish royalists, and basically get the Peruvian people on their side, and therefore do the same thing to Peru that they had just done to Quito, which is basically take it over. So Bolivar is thinking about trying to bring Peru and probably the whole western and possibly southern coastline of South America under the government of Gran Colombia, to make this kind of Gran Colombian state into a South American superstate. So Bolivar kind of scuttles any possible deal with San Martin. And San Martin returns to Peru very ill and feeling very defeated and worried for the long term of Peru. And so he resigns as the leader of Peru and goes into exile. He goes to Europe in September 1822, and he'll never return. So that's the end of San Martin, basically, in this story in Latin America. San Martin will survive in Europe. He'll continue to live. I think he dies somewhere around 1850. So he lives to see the long-term effects of a lot of these things that he had put into motion, and he writes and speaks out about certain things that are going on in Latin America through the rest of his life. So now Peru has to appoint a whole new leader in 1822, and they appoint a new president who, you know, makes a bunch of mistakes, and he's a fairly weak president. And this new president continues asking Bolivar for help to stabilize Peru. And at this point, Bolivar seems to have really seen this as his opportunity, and Bolivar will send in a whole bunch of troops, something like 4,000 troops under General Sucre. And they will land in Lima, the capital city, in June 1823, and will defeat the royalist forces in Lima. And at this point, Bolivar, you know, sees his opportunity to try to take over Peru. And the Peruvian Congress, though, is desperately fighting with its own president. There's a lot of infighting there that's just takes too long for us to go over on a course like this. So eventually, the Peruvian Congress removed their own president, and in desperation, appoints Bolivar to be dictator of Peru, they hope for the short term at least, in September 1823. Basically to just stabilize the Peruvian politics and the Peruvian government. So Bolivar accepted that and travels into Lima to accept leadership of the Peruvian government. His first mission was to arrest the previous president, who the Congress had kicked out. And Bolivar basically is on the road to declaring Peru to be an ally and possibly a peace. He's thinking about annexing Peru into the Grand Colombian superstate in the north. The problem, though, is that a lot of Peruvians hate this idea. They want to have their own independent government. So a lot of Peruvians at this point are starting to fear Colombia and Bolivar's ambitions to control Peru even more than they feared the Spanish royalists in the first place. And Peru is such a just gigantic mess that even the royalists who survived in Peru, they start fighting amongst each other over whether or not any royalist victory should build a kind of independent or colonial Peruvian government to make it back into a viceroyalty under the Spanish Empire. And if they're going to do that, what kind of constitution do they want to have? Do they want to have the 1812 constitution that was very liberal? Or at this point, Ferdinand VII has ended the constitution of 1812 in Spain itself, and he's going back to his old kind of dictatorship powers, his old absolutist powers. So there's other royalists that want to create a new constitution that would give full absolutist powers and recognize them in any colony that they build. So even the royalists are split amongst themselves between liberals and absolutists. So it's extremely kind of confusing and messy in Peru for these few years because there's so many different factions that are going to be fighting for so many different outcomes. But Bolivar uses these divisions inside Peru to build an army and bring in more soldiers from the northern area in Quito. And he invades with this army into Peru and finally defeats the royalists completely by August of 1824. And Sucre kind of defeats the very last of the royalist remnants in December 1824, and so Bolivar enters Lima at the end of the year in 1824 with basically full control over the government. So Bolivar has full control over Peru by February 1825 or so, and basically demanded that the Peruvian Congress make him dictator for a year to take the fight to the rest of the royalists who have fled Peru and gone into the area of Upper Peru, which is on this map called Bolivia. So the royalists have retreated to higher ground, basically higher elevations. And Bolivar is demanding that the Peruvian Congress make him dictator so he has the power to take an army into Upper Peru and attack the royalists there. And the Peruvian Congress gives in, and they do make him dictator of Peru. So Bolivar sends Sucre to move his forces into Upper Peru in early 1825, and Sucre, with that army, defeats the royalists there. And the royalists kind of start fighting amongst themselves, and they assassinate their own leaders and whatnot. So again, it's messy. But Sucre basically is in control of Upper Peru by spring 1825. And Sucre and Bolivar kind of decide among themselves, just them two really, in spring 1825, that Upper Peru should be its own government because of its increased elevation. It's a very different civilization, different society, different culture from the rest of Peru. So Bolivar and Sucre decide to kind of break off Upper Peru and allow it to become its own nation. So Sucre convenes a constitutional convention to write a constitution for Upper Peru to become its own country. And that group gathers and they declare Upper Peru an independent country, and they rename itself Bolivia in honor of Simón Bolívar. And Bolívar basically writes their constitution for them, and they're going to approve it for the most part. So Bolívar writes a constitution that creates a president for life that basically has most government powers, and the president will appoint his successor. And it creates a legislature that's fairly weak. So the president will basically have most of the power in the government. And Bolivar writes this, and even at the time, he says that he doesn't like elections, he doesn't like democracy. He says that popular elections are, quote, the scourge of republics, end quote, because they lead to basically political anarchy. So Bolivar doesn't like debate, he doesn't like dissent. He thinks that real freedom is the freedom to live basically under a king or an emperor or a dictator of some kind, and it's the dictator's responsibility to listen to the people and do what's best for all the people of the area, of the territory. So that's Bolivar's kind of take on what a republic should be. So the Bolivian Assembly basically adopts his constitution in July 1826, and they will elect Sucre to be president for life. So Sucre will he'll be president for a few years. His large task is to reform and really get the Bolivarian government up and running and get its economy functioning. But Sucre gets tired of that job and he resigns in 1828, basically to go back home to his family in Quito. So in 1828, that's really where Bolivia kind of starts off on its own independent path of being an independent government outside of Bolivar and Sucre and Colombia's control. And in August 1826, Bolivar convened a constituent assembly in Peru to write a Peruvian constitution and got his own version passed. And the Peruvian government chose him to be president for life of Peru. So at this point, Bolivar is really accomplishing almost all of its major goals, all of his own major goals. And that goal, if we kind of go back to the map, is to build a South American superstate under the title of the government of Gran Colombia, the Republic of Gran Colombia. And he seems very close to doing this in summer 1826. So previously he had fought revolutions starting off in Venezuela, as we went through last time, and those revolutions eventually got all the way to Bogota, which brought Colombia into the Venezuelan revolutions and created an alliance basically between Colombia and Venezuela. And that was the start of the government of Gran Colombia. And as we've seen in this lecture, Bolivar has been pushing that Gran Colombian government to expand to basically take over and control Quito, and now they're doing the same for Peru. So Bolivar appears on the doorstep of achieving his goal of building this South American superstate that would dominate probably the whole western and northern coast of the South American continent. Of course, a lot of Peru's liberals who don't really want to be under Colombia's direct control, they want to be more independent. They start criticizing Bolivar and his refusal to really allow elections, and his despotic and dictatorial type of nature, his general leadership. And the general Peruvian population starts to complain and demand more democracy and home rule for themselves by late 1826. So this is a map of kind of Gran Colombia at its height in the summer of 1826. But going into the next section, Bolivar, even though he's president of Peru, he has to go back to Colombia in September 1826 to settle a bunch of disputes between, basically between Venezuelan leaders and Colombian leaders. And when he personally leaves Lima and goes back north, a lot of Peruvian leaders see that as an opportunity to rebel against his government and end the Constitution, and basically go off on their own independent path. So the Peruvian leaders will take that opportunity in late 1826, and they do basically trash the Bolivarian Constitution in January 1827, and immediately start negotiating with the political leaders of Gran Colombia to get Colombia to take its troops out of Peru to guarantee Peruvian independence. And later in June 1827, Peru will convene its own assembly to write its own constitution and really put them on the path of real, actual independence. So Peru basically goes independent in throughout 1827. Bolivar's next big problem is there's a political split in the Gran Colombian area, on this map what is Colombia and Venezuela. And that split is largely between liberals that want kind of rebuilding of the Colombian Constitution, and who will push for reforms to that Constitution to get more democracy. And the Bolivarian kind of party, Bolivar's personal followers, that want to stop that and basically keep Bolivar in power. So a new constituent assembly meets in spring of 1828 with the supposed job of reforming the Constitution to make changes to it. The problem, though, is that that assembly that meets to do that is so evenly split between the liberals and the Bolivarians that it couldn't agree on anything. It couldn't pass any policies or any changes to the Constitution. And at that point, Bolivar used his kind of existing constitutional powers to revoke the government and end a lot of civil liberties, and basically end the government itself and build a dictatorship under himself for, he says, stability. So he says that he's going to run a dictatorship for Gran Colombia until a whole new group can be elected to meet in 1830 and start rewriting the Constitution again. So he says this is a short-term thing. his former vice president really disagrees with a lot of this, so he fires the vice president to consolidate power under his own position. And most Colombians really hate this dictatorship. They view this as illegitimate. They see this as Bolivar going way too far. And so there's even an assassination attempt on Bolivar personally in late 1828. So that shows us just how much hatred there is in the population of what he's done. And Bolivar, hates the fact that someone tried to kill him, and he runs an investigation and finds that a lot of his own military leaders were involved in the plot. And he accuses them and formally kind of puts them on trial and has a bunch of them executed. And that conspiracy supposedly went all the way up to his former vice president, Santander. And Bolivar wanted to execute him too, but there's so much public outcry against that that Bolivar instead only just kicked Santander out of the country and put him into exile. So that shows us just how much outrage and how much protest there is against Bolivar in the Grand Colombian territory. And we have to remember that in 1828, this is also when Sucre is resigning as the president of Bolivia. So he's leaving Bolivia to go back to his family. And so Bolivia at this point also is going independent. So it's escaping Bolivar's grasp, basically. So 1827-28 is really the kind of collapse phase of Bolivar's dream of all these areas being under one government and building this kind of South American superstate. So at this point in 1828, a lot of Peruvian leaders see an opportunity to raise an army and invade northward from Peru to take some land, especially from Quito. So this leads to a war between Colombia, the Grand Colombia, which owns Quito, and Peru in 1828. So Bolivar sends Sucre out, basically again, his most trusted general, to go off and try to defeat the Peruvian invasion. And Sucre does win that war, so he pushes the Peruvians back. But at the same time, a lot of Venezuelans under a former general of Bolivar's named Paez, they rebel in Venezuela itself when Bolivar starts supporting this idea of this new constitution that will make him, Bolivar, president of Gran Colombia for life. So that angered a lot of Venezuelans in just one part of Gran Colombia. So a lot of Venezuelans are kind of up in arms, and that will eventually lead to their kind of independence movement. As the Constituent Assembly that gathers in 1830 fails to write a new constitution for all of Gran Colombia in that year, everything just kind of breaks apart. Everything falls apart. Venezuela formally proclaims independence from Gran Colombia in May 1830. And just the next week, Quito proclaims independence. The whole kingdom, the whole area in green, tries to break away from Gran Colombia and formally changes its name to Ecuador to become an independent country. So General Sucre is on his way returning back to Quito to basically go back home to his family, and he's assassinated en route as he tries to get to Quito in June 1830. So that was Bolivar's most trusted lieutenant at a time when a lot of his other former allies are turning against him in Gran Colombia. So that seems to be basically the end of Gran Colombia, because it's going to split off into these other kind of independent countries. And Bolivar himself will die of tuberculosis in December 1830. So that's the end of this superstate he was trying to build. So it appears that a lot of the Latin American middle and upper classes were very worried about the stability of their governments. And they're very worried about the stability of even these newly independent countries that are being created in 1830. So even as they really wanted government stability, some of them will want to bring back the Spanish monarchy sometimes even. So there's a lot of argument about what to do for the long term for these newly independent governments. But they're also very critical of Spain because of its arrogance and its pride and its desire to control all these areas as colonies. So that's something that a lot of these newly independent countries are going to have to figure out as they go into their long-term future. But we don't have time in this course to talk about their long-term development after 1830, so we're going to have to kind of end their story here. And we'll go on to the Brazilian Revolution to finish off the independence movements throughout South America. So the Brazilian independence movement is really a direct result of the wars with Napoleon. Remember, going a few lectures back, we talked about how Napoleon wanted to run this European-wide boycott against Britain in order to win his war against Britain. And so to do that, he started to boycott the continental system in 1807. But in order to have a boycott, he needed all of Europe on his side. So he had to force Portugal into this system, this boycott. And so he invaded Portugal, and that had convinced the Portuguese king to take his government out of Portugal, because he realized he couldn't defeat Napoleon's army. So he takes his government out of Portugal, and they go to Brazil in 1807, 1808. So you know, the Portuguese government is there, about 15,000 of them sitting in Brazil, and you know, they're having to deal with Brazilian politics also. And you know, Rio de Janeiro's population is growing massively, so it's up to about 100,000 residents by the year 1810 or so. And a lot of the wealthy elite of the city and of Brazil in general have a lot of demands. And now that their king is there in Brazil, he's a lot closer to them to kind of make demands in person. The king starts making some decisions related to Brazil directly. And one of the big ones is that he basically gave into British government demands to regulate the slave trade in Brazil, which outraged a lot of sugar producers and agricultural farmland, big landowners, because they felt that that was going to reduce their profit. So a lot of those landowners felt that government regulation of the slave trade might push the prices of slaves higher. At the same time that the sugar and farming export market is collapsing, their prices are collapsing, because now that Napoleon's been defeated in 1815, the wars are over, and that means that the other Caribbean islands and other areas that have been kind of not able to produce sugar very much because they've been fighting wars, now that the war is over, they're going to start producing sugar a lot more, which means the market for sugar is going to be flooded, which means the price is going to go down. So the sugar producers in Brazil are very worried about the collapse in their sugar prices, and so they're also worried that the king's decree is going to increase the price of slaves at the worst time possible, when they're already facing an economic catastrophe. So a lot of the sugar producers and the big landowners in Brazil are very critical of their king. So that's one thing that's going to kind of feed a lot of rebellious sentiment among some of the wealthy elites. But Brazil mostly remained pretty stable. There's only kind of one small uprising in Brazil in these years. So most of Brazil was very loyal to the king. They criticize the king, but they don't want to rise up in revolution against him. They don't want to make Brazil into an independent country. So it's really Brazil's internal instability that will foment or Portugal's internal instability that will foment a lot of the Brazilian revolt in the 1820s. So King João, he's still in Brazil when Napoleon is defeated for obvious reasons. And once Napoleon is defeated, the Portuguese government basically starts asking him to come home. And they're going to start rewriting the Portuguese constitution. The king has a decision to make. He can go back to Portugal and be involved in the negotiations over this new constitution and try to influence it. But he's very worried that he's not going to get what he really wants, even if he goes back. So he decides to stay in Brazil, even as the new constitution is being written. And as it starts getting written, the group that is basically running Brazil, or running Portugal for the most part, the elected legislature, they invite Brazil to send a whole bunch of delegates, representatives, to Portugal. About 75 Brazilians will have open seats in the Portuguese parliament, the Cortes, out of 200 total members of the Cortes. So Brazilians, as a voting bloc, can have a whole lot of influence over the parliament and the laws that they're going to pass. But the legislature still wants Brazil to be in a subservient position as a colony. So eventually they do write a constitution in 1821 for Portugal. And the king is again, he's torn about going back to Portugal. A lot of Brazilians try to convince the king to stay in Brazil because they're worried if he goes back to Portugal that they'll lose their influence over him, because it's very easy to talk to him and give him advice or make demands or whatever while he's in Brazil itself. And they're worried if he goes back to Portugal, he will listen to his lawmakers in Portugal itself, and he'll push Brazil back into a fully colonial status. And the king had made moves to make Brazil into an equal kingdom in the empire, equal to Portugal itself. So the Brazilians really want to keep that status, that elevated status, and they're worried if he goes back to Portugal, he's going to kind of drop them back down into colonial status at some point. So the king, he's having trouble making decision. He's worried that if he returns to Portugal, that he might be forced to accept a constitution that really limits his power. So he thinks that he'll be able to keep even more power if he stays in Brazil. But eventually the kind of Portuguese people's demand and their lawmakers' demand for him to return eventually convinces him to go back to Portugal. So he leaves with his whole court, all his government that's with him in Brazil, those 15,000 or so. And the vast majority of them leave to go back to Portugal in July 1821. And he largely does that to go back and really deal with the new constitution and try to keep as much power as he possibly can into the constitution to really negotiate. So when he goes back to Portugal, he leaves his son, his eldest son, named Pedro, in Brazil to oversee Brazil as kind of his regent, his authority in Brazil, his like governor in Brazil. But that's not good enough for the lawmakers in Portugal itself. Once they hear of this, they start issuing demands that Pedro himself, kind of the heir to the throne of Portugal, that he go back to Portugal also. And this starts a conflict. So there's an official demand that Pedro return to Portugal. And Pedro is in Brazil, and he's hearing a lot of promises from the Brazilian leaders that he should stay in Brazil and that they will sign loyalty oaths to him and all kinds of things. And the Brazilian troops, the soldiers in Brazil, do officially swear loyalty to him personally, and that they will refuse to let any Portuguese troops land in Brazil. So this is a growing possible conflict over Pedro's status and where he's going to live. And Pedro sees, quite honestly, a good opportunity to stay in Brazil and basically be king of Brazil there. So, why be just a heir to the throne in Portugal for who knows how long, whereas he can just stay in Brazil and be a full-fledged king there. And that's really the decision he makes. So Pedro will decide to stay in Brazil against the kind of official demands of the Portuguese government, and at that point the Brazilians will get together and start writing their own constitution. And Pedro sends a message to Portugal, to the lawmakers, the Cortes, saying that the laws that they pass will only actually be enforced in Brazil if he signs off on the law, which is, possibly a treasonous statement, because he's not king of anything officially. So at this point, the political leaders in Portugal, the legislature, formally accuse the Brazilian leaders that are going to write their own constitution of treason. The Portuguese government says that they're going to start sending troops to Brazil to arrest those leaders and bring them back to Portugal for trial. And that's what really pushes things to a head in summer and fall of 1822. And that pushes Pedro to formally proclaim Brazil as an independent country. And the Brazilian leaders like this a lot, and they proclaim him to be their emperor of their new country, their new empire. So he becomes known as Emperor Pedro I of Brazil. And at this point, the Portuguese government basically backs off because they realize they don't have the power to stop this. And if they really want to send soldiers into Brazil, that could, basically start a civil war. And the Portuguese government doesn't really think that they want to do that. So the Portuguese government backs off, and Brazil basically becomes an independent country through a bloodless revolution. Britain says that it will defend Brazilian independence by saying that it will not tolerate any European move against Brazilian independence, either from Portugal or any other country, to try to conquer Brazil and turn it into a colony. And Britain's statement about that is really important because Britain has the most powerful navy in the world, and now that they've defeated Napoleon, Britain is by far the most powerful country on the planet. So any country, especially any European country, that would go against Britain would basically be like declaring war against the most powerful country in the world. So Britain's promises to protect Brazilian independence are extremely important to guaranteeing Brazil's independence for the far-term future. And Pedro will continue as the emperor, and the Brazilian monarchy will continue as the official Brazilian government through the 1880s. So the Brazilian Constitution goes into effect, and they have a monarchy, and the monarchy is basically just the executive branch. So the Constitution really constrained the monarchy's powers, and the Constitution will create a legislature, and Brazil will continue on its independent path into the far-term future. So as we end this lecture, all of South America has declared and won independence. Brazil, through a pretty bloodless, just kind of legalistic argument, but a lot more bloody conflicts, especially in the north, in Venezuela and Colombia, and other military-led revolutionary movements through warfare on the battlefield in the western coastline of South America, notably, Quito and Peru, and the areas south of Peru or Bolivia. So warfare was a big part of it, but those wars were not nearly as bloody as the gigantic civil wars and race wars, especially in Venezuela in the north. So as we end this lecture and largely this module, South America is independent, and that's where we're going to end the course for here, and we're going to take the next exam based on these independence movements and their relationship to the French Revolution and Napoleon and whatnot.